everybody. Let's call the meeting to order. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Transportation Committee meeting of Wednesday, June 14th. I'm Councilmember Mike Bonham, the chair, joined by Councilmembers Nuri Martinez from the 6th District and David Rue from the 4th District. Mr. Corrett should be with us shortly, and that'll be the composition of the committee today. We have a series of public comment cards. So I'm going to start with general public comment, and I'm going to close acceptance of cards for public comment at this time. Mr. Pigg, you have 3 minutes, 2 minutes for public comment, and then 1 for general public comment.
Yes.
For the record, Mr. Koretz is here.
Yes, we're joined by Mr. Koretz, who doesn't care about synagogues in Encino. Yes. So, number one, we want the oversized vehicles to remain. We don't like this shit. Let's see, number two, in CD8, there's no jobs. Let people live in their campers. And number 3, CD10, fuck that too. We want people to live in campers and not in tents. Yes, number 4 has a good premise. Yes, I support number 4. Give Mr. Buscaino a break on all the campers because they come from Venice and then they go down to terrorize him.
Mr. Herman, you're disrupting the meeting. This is your first and only warning. You're continuing to disrupt the meeting. I'd like Mr. Sergeant Arms, please escort Mr. Herman from the room.
No, he wants to submit cards.
So you can't submit cards because I'm 1 minute late. But Paul Koretz walking late, puto, and you throw me out now? Wow. You're a fucking fag.
Noting for the record that Mr. Herman continues to disrupt the meeting.
And I came by walking. Stupid scumbag politician, dirtbag.
You may continue, Mr. Pigg.
Oh, thank you. And for the record, I'm sorry I made the goat sound. I meant to do because I'm not a goat. Okay. Now we get to more of this stupid shit. Let's see. 5. Oh, and 5 and 6. Oversized vehicles. No, on this shit. Let people stay in their little vehicles. They're very, very nice. The campers, they're so nice. They have little stoves and refrigerators. But Nuri doesn't like it. Number 7 and 8, Nuri attacking the homeless. 9, 10, oh my God, 11. All from Nuri. Nuri's kicking out people from their campers. You terrorist. I cannot believe what's happening in CD 6. Number 13, 14, 15. More. She's kicking out everybody living in campers. This liar. She said you could do it. You evil woman, you pig. No on all of those items. Come on now. Where are they supposed to go? CD12? No. Horrible shit. Now we get CD4, Mr. Yeah, well, we like him. We support it just because we like him. Number 17, 18, 19 is more of the same shit. New transportation metrics. We're not on the metric system. We're on the fucking English system. I cannot add metrics. Parking a vehicle on a parkway. We support it, yes. Free parking for everybody. Especially synagogues on Ventura Boulevard, which are under assault by LADBT because they're anti-Semites. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 2 other general public comment cards, Valerie Keegan and Dr. Tom Williams. Please come on up. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Valerie Keegan. I'm here today from Hollywood area, the residential, quiet part of Hollywood area. We are hearing a lot about Vision Zero. Thank you so much for all of you for your work on Vision Zero. I've come to ask you to look at some changes to Vision Zero. We have a project that's coming in that will generate 4,600 daily vehicle trips and is planning to put the driveway directly right next to Gardner Elementary School. This is a small local street. It's a 5-foot path sidewalk with a barely 3-foot wide. If we can put an 800-foot buffer around pot shops, we can try to do this on the intensity of use or driveways that are maybe around our elementary schools. Just because we're Sunset Boulevard, we have 2 HPOZs right there, does not mean we're high intensity, high use. We asked to have a children identifying crosswalk at Gardner Street, but we were turned down by LADOT because they said that there's a traffic light there, so we're not allowed to have that. Just some kind of policy or something to look at for the future. It's the intensity of use.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Williams, good afternoon.
Hi. Good afternoon. Dr. Tom Williams, LA 32 Neighborhood Council Land Use Committee, and others. Last night we had Vision Zero on Fletcher. It was a tragic waste of everybody's time. There was no presentation as to what the process was for the format. There was no context given. There was no future timeline given. Nothing was given. In fact, the comment cards did not require name, address, any sort of contact information. It was a tragic waste of 60 people in about this size area room. It was a waste of time. Get somebody who knows how to operate a public presentation and comment periods for Vision Zero. I am, 1972, I did Center for Independent Living, so I know a little bit about ADA and a few others.
Thank you very much. All right, that concludes general public comment. Colleagues, for this agenda, we have 2 agendas. One is the regular council meeting, and then there's a special because item 21 was mislisted with the wrong council file. So item 21 I'm going to recommend we receive and file, in so much as that it's actually item 22 on the next agenda. That objection. And then I'm going to recommend items 1 through 19 for consent approval. Okay. So with that objection, those are the orders of the committee to approve those. And that brings us to item 20.
Item 20 is a joint LADOT Department of City Planning report relative to the city's adoption of new transportation metrics and compliance with Senate Bill 743.
Okay. Before we start, there's one public comment card. I'll ask Dr. Williams, would you like to do your comment to start? Dr. Williams? Sure, if you would prefer. Okay, so colleagues, let me sort of set this one up a bit because this is an incredibly dense and incredibly important topic, and we could easily go down an acronym-filled rabbit hole into sort of a graduate school planning seminar, which I hope we will do our best to avoid.
Or brevity.
Let me sort of explain the context by which I understand this, and then correct me if I'm wrong, and then I'll do a couple entry questions we can go into it. So, state legislature passed a bill, it was SB 743, is that what you said?
Yes.
A couple years ago, which requires that local jurisdictions start doing a different type of traffic analysis for CEQA projects only, as I understand it, changing the way we evaluate them for potential mitigation from LOS, which is level of service, we'll permit that acronym, to VMT, which is the other permitted acronym of vehicle miles traveled. Basically, as I understand it, that means instead of looking at how fast or slowly cars move through an intersection as our primary metric, we will be looking at greenhouse gas emissions and how many vehicle miles traveled are generated by a project. I got that right?
Yes.
That's right.
So the state passed this law. They're doing some rules for a while, and then once they finish the rules, we've got about 2 years to have our local rules in place. Is that
Yes.
more or less correct?
Yes.
So my first question...
We don't have to wait that long.
But we don't have to wait that long, because Santa Monica, some other cities have already put their rules in place.
That's correct.
So is this a case of, there's a couple things in my mind that are potential sort of analogies about what the state has done and what flexibility we have. One is the accessory dwelling unit rule, where if we don't act, the state rules are in place. The other is sort of medical, or is marijuana, where the state is basically saying, okay, you guys figure it out. Which of these is more analogous? The state giving us a set of things that we either modify or follow, or us having to figure out how to do what they've told us to do?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, it's really primarily the first one, but the city has a lot of leeway in terms of how we want to figure it out, the tools we want to put in place, and the thresholds, the way we measure the projects.
Okay. So,
But yeah, I mean, to clarify that if we don't act to replace the level of service-based evaluation method with vehicle miles traveled within that time frame, then we are no longer permitted to apply the level of service-based threshold, leaving us without any evaluation metric once this comes into place.
so if we don't come up with guidelines to comply with the state law on VMT, we basically can't measure or mitigate traffic impacts from development projects.
Well, we'd have to, yeah, I mean, absent our own criteria, you know, it's going to be difficult
If we
for
don't
us
do
to be able
something
to, yeah.
Okay. So that sounds simple, but it clearly is complex. And I guess where you're going to get to now is explain to us what steps happen between now and then. And I guess the core question is, how do we measure and predict what the vehicle miles traveled would be for a particular project? Is that correct?
Right. So we're going to actually invite up Jeremy Klopp in a few minutes to actually help us with this presentation. He's been the consultant with Fair and Peers, helping us develop some of these tools and helping us really do the really rigorous analysis over the last months to figure out like really what the program looks like. So he's going to walk us through some of the background on that, how we've gotten to that, and then David's going to walk us through some of the tools. What I want to introduce, though, to you first is actually some staff changes that have taken place between our different departments. David Summers, as you probably all have known, was with the planning department for many years, was part of our mobility team in Citywide. David has actually recently joined DOT. So while he was the project manager on this project, he is now at DOT, but still working on this project in his new role at DOT under Thomas Carranza. But we then in planning and exchange got Rubina Gazarian, who was actually at DOT working also with Thomas Carranza. So Rubina has joined us recently. So we have some new staff. Just wanted to introduce you to them, but they'll both be working in their new respective roles, on this effort as it goes forward into implementation and adoption.
Whenever staff is at the table explaining something complex, I keep half an eye on the relevant general manager to see if they're agreeing. So now I just
I hope they're both back there.
so David, I can see. Okay, all right.
Great. So we're going to tag team this presentation a little bit, but I am going to have Jeremy come up and give us kind of the first half in terms of helping us set the stage and some of the important messaging.
Great. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Klopp. I'm a principal with Fair and Peers Transportation Consultants. Been working in the industry for many years and been working with this team over the last 5 or so on questions like this. I'm going to give some framing and contextual overview, very similar to what you just described, maybe with a little more detail. And then David's going to go through some of the details on the how and what this means in practice. Okay. The short framing that you did is actually very consistent with what's happening throughout the state. California is really grappling with this in a way across the country that many communities are facing changes in the way that transportation systems are being evaluated. And LA is really leading in many ways that conversation. both through some of the actions you're already taking in terms of transforming the transportation network as customer changing preferences are being felt, but also in the way that you're taking sort of policy objectives coming down from the state and up from the city and putting those into practice. One of the reasons for that is that the outcomes from our current policies aren't always delivering the infrastructure changes that are consistent with community priorities. And so one of the reasons we need to get this right is that if we measure only one aspect of the transportation system and we provide infrastructure in response to only that one aspect of the transportation system, we may have unintended consequences that we need to come back and fix later, and they're not inexpensive fixes later. So what are some of those changes we're seeing, and where are they being felt? One of the real practical challenges is that it is very expensive and difficult to widen our way out of congestion. I think that's been well recognized here. Lots across the state are coming to that realization through budget challenges, maintenance challenges, and just practical matters of expanding and applying the existing metrics, which are saying add capacity, widen intersections, these will solve our problems, when in fact they're not really getting us there. At the same time, our customers are still asking us to ease traffic, and we're being asked to do more with what we have out there, and managing that system more effectively is an important part of this process. Second, communities like LA are facing interest and enjoying continued growth in economic activity. And that's an important thing that we want to facilitate with continued transportation investments, and transportation investments are critical to that ongoing economic activity. So that's a key aspect here, that the retail, residential, community value and performance of the system, it's not just about mobility, it's also about the value that's created in the system and who's benefiting from that value. And then another aspect that really is different than I think in the transportation industry from 20 years ago. We're hearing different things from our customers as to what they're preferring us to provide. So more interest in active transportation, more interest in being able to age in place and be able to walk to destinations even after somebody may lose their ability to drive for health reasons or for ability reasons, and communities that work better for many different ways of getting around. We're hearing that more and more in our planning processes. We're also seeing a rapid change in technology and its influence over how the transportation system is operating and how people are accessing those services, whether that's through new ways of getting around or using technology to access services and transportation, and whether that's new private sector players and other transportation providers who we're partnering with to deliver those services that traditionally have really been the function of the city and the city alone. Where that's taking the industry, and California in particular, is toward new ways of measuring what we're trying to deliver. So rather than asking how fast can we move through a place, we're asking what can I get to, and how complete is my neighborhood? Do I have all the things I would like to get to relatively nearby? How would I measure that? Accessibility is one of the ways that communities are moving, and this is the direction that the city is going as well in response. Another aspect is, do I have choices for how I can get to those things? What are my mode choices? Can I get there via the way I'd like to get there? And is it easy? Is it expensive? Is it inexpensive? Is it even available to me? And last, how far do I have to go to get to those things? Designed and planned and organized and operated communities have many things nearby that you don't have to travel as far practically. That makes us more resilient, more economically competitive, and ultimately requires people to spend less of their time and energy and money getting around. One example of that is really captured, I think, in a clean way in this Go LA app, where through a partnership with Xerox, the city said, let's at least serve more information about this. Many of you are familiar with it, but one of the things it does is it captures all those things. If you want to travel quickly, you want to travel cheaply, you want to travel by a particular mode, we're getting better at providing all of this framing for the services, and I think it's a good example of the complexity that our customers are expecting us to be involved with and provide. So what that means practically from a sort of outside pressure and customer changing perspective, and what that means for how we practice transportation and evaluate projects in particular, is that we need to find ways to better integrate these new metrics into our day-to-day development review and project evaluation processes. There's other legislative and policy context for this as well. We're going to focus primarily on the Senate Bill 743 component today, and it's rightly described by you, Councilman Bonin, taking away our ability to use LOS as a CEQA threshold. It's very clear that that can no longer be used in the CEQA context, and the guidance currently is to replace that with vehicle miles of travel per capita. So that's something we'll explain a little bit more about. But there's also quite a bit of supporting policy context for this, both at the state level and within the city, and there are many reinforcing documents along these lines. I want to hand it over to David to talk a little bit more about the CEQA piece, and I'll be happy to answer questions along the way technically as they come.
Thanks for the background, Jeremy. David Summers, Department of Transportation. So I'll be going into details about how we're addressing these important questions from a technical perspective. There we go. So what we see here are the questions that are going to be incorporated into the new CEQA guidelines checklist. That this is the draft, the current draft in the Office of Planning and Research recommendations. And what we'd like to focus on is that there's...
Excuse me, David.
Yep.
That was a disruptive activity, playing your phone. One more noise and you're being escorted out, Mr. Spindler.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
And for the record, he's been doing that throughout the meeting and having his pig snort throughout the meeting as well to disrupt it.
Okay, out.
So what we see here is the new checklist questions that will be published in the future CEQA guidelines. And what I'd like to point out is that this question around vehicle miles traveled is just one of the questions that is going to be asked within the new CEQA guidelines checklist. And we're going to continue to evaluate project impact performance of the transportation system from a safety and access perspective, and we can come back in a later time to address about how, what our approach is to be doing that. But the remainder of this presentation will just be focused on that second question, which is how are we, is the project having a substantial increase in additional vehicle miles traveled? So as you accurately described, we are transitioning from level of service to vehicle miles traveled. When we evaluate impacts based on delay, it's purely a function of how many cars are moving through an intersection. And the way we tend to solve for this problem is by increasing throughput capacity, often at the expense of other travel modes. And we're also, it's a problem of scale because we're only looking at the local intersections and not how a project is affecting the greater transportation system is how far they're traveling through the system. So that's something that's currently overlooked in the current evaluation framework.
Also disregard safety, among other.
That's correct. So safety is not also addressed in this approach. And sometimes you can have actually conflicting solutions that result. So transitioning to vehicle miles traveled, we're able to account for the context of the development, how much the development reinforces other travel choices, how it improves access to common destinations through proximity to transit, jobs, and neighborhood services. By moving from LOS to VMT, we can improve multiple outcomes by evaluating the impacts based on travel distance and encourage development near transit and promote more diverse travel options. This way we can bring our CEQA process into alignment with the city's sustainability goals. So we've been working on this diligently the last couple of years. We actually got a $500,000 grant from the State Strategic Growth Council. We were able to take on Fair and Peers have been doing really terrific work for us. And I'm just going to provide a brief overview of what the updates we have to date. We've updated our travel demand forecasting model to provide a clear picture of where and how far people are traveling in any given area in the city. This will be the first city model to rely on newly available robust travel data sources in the validation process, which guarantees a greater degree of accuracy. We also took this opportunity to collect data to ensure our process reflects LA conditions and nuances. We collected trip and parking data from a host of affordable housing sites, as well as mixed-use infill development and office and market rate housing. We use this data to build the city's own project evaluation model, which will be able to further predict how neighborhood and site characteristics influence travel patterns. With this transition to a new approach, we knew we needed to use the lens of equity to better explore the relationship between affordable housing and travel behavior. We looked at household travel survey, and it shows that average driving miles can be about half for the lowest income households compared to the highest income. This indicates that we do not properly account for this intrinsic benefit when we review traffic reports that affordable housing provides in our transportation system.
So let me pause there and clarify something. My understanding is that when we do evaluations based on level of service, sort of the formula we use is from ITE or something?
Correct.
Instead of a national standard. Which
That's right. That's right.
Probably does not accurately reflect LA as a whole, certainly not our sort of micro.
That could be the case.
That is
So
what we found.
What we're doing
yeah.
here is coming up with a model that will be more LA specific and then presumably more accurate.
That's absolutely right.
And
Yeah.
it's also going to be, if I'm not mistaken, not just an LA standard, but one that is sort of regional. It will evaluate the West Side differently than San Pedro or the Valley or something.
That's right. Each area will have its own measuring stick, if you will, and I'll be getting into that in the next slide.
Okay, and just one other one. The way I understand, because we're talking about VMT and how far people travel, the way I understand it is under the current standard, pretty much there's one measure for evaluating the impacts of a retail establishment, for instance, right? Under this, we would be able to sort of have a different measurement, presumably, I don't know if you're doing it, but presumably for neighborhood serving retail than we would for something which is more of a regional draw and would therefore get traffic from further away, right?
We could apply. We could look at those uses differently. So one example of the smaller scale project, we could use our project evaluation model. There would be presumably projects that are so big in scale, they're major regional attractions. That would be a good exercise for our travel demand forecasting model to really tell how is that actually redistributing trips through the region, because that's really the scale of a problem that we can test through that evaluation framework. And so we're going to develop guidelines on which applies, to the specific project. But I just wanted to hone in here the results of the data that we did collect. It did verify that, especially for affordable housing uses, ITE generally overpredicts the amount of driving that occurs from those sites, and specifically in Los Angeles, we found that if just family affordable income that were 100% reserved for affordable were just 62% of the trip rate that's assigned to apartment that we would otherwise apply. And that if we're talking about permanent supportive housing, that goes down to just 18% of the apartment rate that we would apply, and 13% if it's located near transit. So a lot of these especially the affordable housing and some of the housing types that we really want to see built in a city, we wanted to ensure that we're giving an accurate reflection of the travel behaviors that are happening at those development projects.
David, it might be just informative for the council people to know that DOT hasn't waited to start applying some of this new information. So I think even in the traffic study guidelines that DOT uses now, they're actually taking these new rates, since we now have this information, and applying it even through the LOS analysis. So it's allowing us to, again, much more subtly review projects and really more clearly understand their impacts.
That's right. That's the latest version of the Transportation Impact Study Guidelines integrates the new trip rate for permanent supportive housing to review some of the projects that we're seeing now.
So you showed places where LOS overestimates the traffic impact. I'm pretty confident I'm not the only member of the committee who thinks that some of our formulas for some things underestimate the traffic impact. Do we also know where those might be?
That's not clear in our approach. I mean, I think that there's, by and large, we focused more on the common projects we typically review as a city. So mixed-use housing projects, market rate housing. So they'll have mixed use. They'll have some component with retail And I think that, Jeremy, can you speak to this? Typically that they were consistently...
I would say that the primary focus here is making sure that the mitigations you get in the context of project evaluations are driving at what the community is really asking for. And right now that's a pound and fit kind of process where this VMT approach will return things like transit passes or other travel demand management strategies more directly that will address those projects that may look fine from an LOS perspective, but may have really substantial burdens that they're placing on the rest of the transportation system. Even if their transportation study in its current format shows that they have impacts at 6 locations and they mitigate those adequately for motorists, there may be many other improvements that aren't captured today that would be with the VMT and TDM based approach.
So in our new evaluation process, we establish clear decision criteria when we need to investigate a project's impact on vehicle miles traveled. Just as we do today, there'll be projects that are very small traffic generators that will be screened out from further analysis. But for projects that we determine to go forward, we'll go through that decision of whether or not they can be exhibited through our project evaluation tool model, or if we're going to have them have to run through the travel demand forecasting model to see how they're actually redistributing trips through the city to better accurately convey what the vehicle miles traveled impact would be. And then, as Jeremy would mention, if they do demonstrate that there is a VMT impact, we have a whole host of mitigation measures that are integrated in the tool that we would apply to see if they have a demonstrative effect on vehicle miles traveled. And then, so are we going to talk about how we set up like the measuring instrument? How do we base project performance? We need to decide what are we comparing that to? So the State Office of Planning and Research has suggested comparing a regional performance target of 15% below regional VMT per capita as a performance target, and where our household VMT per capita is nearly just half of the regional average. The likely consequence of adopting a regional performance threshold is that we would rarely demonstrate a VMT impact and a reason to look for viable solutions. So we had a peer evaluation panel that helped kind of frame the analysis and the discussion around this, and we determined that we'd be well suited to evaluate project impacts relative to the performance at the area planning commission level. And that does several things. It allows, it accounts for the city's diverse neighborhoods and geographic context. It allows to take into consideration basically the local travel characteristics, but it's still a meaningful geography of analysis to be able to inform, relative performance at the project level. This means that a development in the valley would be compared to a valley average rather than assessed against the characteristics of, say, downtown LA. And these are, on the chart on the left, is just showing what the VMT per capita targets would be applying an area planning commission approach. So you see some of our area planning commissions, the areas, the thresholds, they do seem to hover at the same level. Some are a bit higher and some are a bit lower. So this is what our project evaluation model will look like. It's fairly intuitive layout. It only requires basic information, a project location, the land use that's being proposed, and intensity. It can account for mixed-use development projects by putting in multiple values for use. It was customized using the local travel characteristics we mentioned. The model considers housing affordability and local neighborhood characteristics that inform travel behavior, such as access to transit or proximity to diverse services. You see on the right, it reports the estimated daily vehicle trips, the daily vehicle miles, and the household VMT per capita. This is an example of a project near USC Village, and it does show in the analysis results that there was a household VMT impact compared to the APC target. In this example, we selected a host of TDM measures from an expandable menu with the VMT adjusted to the right side of the table there. And we were able to reduce, in this specific example, we were able to reduce the VMT impact to below the level of significance with applying the mitigation measures in the menu. And we'll show the menu that we would be applying here. These are the broad categories that the mitigation measures are organized around. The measures include parking management, transit incentives, neighborhood traffic calming. These help make transportation choices more transparent to the user. They can also help to take advantage of new mobility platforms that further expand choice, such as membership to car share services. A bundle of services can change behavior and incentives and help provide the level of comfort to even perhaps live without a car in Los Angeles. So if somebody's selecting, they're moving into a development project and there's an option to be a car share member, and there's a car share member parking at the development project. Maybe it's a point-to-point service. That may provide the level of comfort that they have enough robust amount of travel options that they may even forgo personal auto ownership. And I think that, at least what I'm hearing from a lot of anecdotal evidence, that there's a lot of, just from driving Lyft around, I hear a lot of people that I'm Lyft lining with that seem to be making similar choices. So this would just kind of help further bolster some of those trends. So we're also building information feedback in the development process. We'll be integrating this VMT evaluation into our transportation study procedures, accounting for the trip characteristics based on local data, informing how we model VMT impacts. We measured against local area VMT characteristics, and a new feedback of monitoring the project performance of travel, where we will collect trip and parking data after these projects are in operation. This will allow us to update and further refine our tools based on the data we collect in our monitoring and evaluation process, ensuring that our evaluation model evolve with greater precision. So we are designing our VMT project evaluation process to not only meet the challenge set by the state through SB 743, but I also think that we're taking the opportunity to develop the tools we need to help ensure we are delivering the outcomes we want to see through our land use review process. That's it for now.
David, I was just going to have you go back a couple of slides. I just wanted to go back two more, back to the tool. I just want to let people know while this model looks very complicated, it's actually going to be something that's going to be very, very easy to use, and that it'll actually be available. I think we're looking to have it available as just as a pilot this summer. So developers, even though the actual new metric won't be in place yet, developers will be able to start using it now. There's been a lot of interest and already starting to see, just be able to compare how their project is doing with VMT compared to LOS. And so we're going to make this tool available really as kind of as a pilot, but something that a developer could download this and then actually do it on their own. And then again, on the right-hand side, because we're not seeing it actually work in real time, as the developer is then putting in the different TDM measures they might want to do, they can kind of see that immediately what the results of incorporating those TDM measures, transportation demand management measures, in their project, how much those are going to affect their actual VMT. So we think it really provides developers or their consultants really kind of an immediate feedback loop in terms of helping them understand. And then, as David was saying, we're going to be able to constantly, update that to make sure that we've got the balance right between the amount of credit we're giving somebody, that we're really over time really determining that those improvements, those measures, those TDM measures really are providing kind of the effective relief in terms of VMT that we hope that they will.
Yeah, I mean, this is dense and detailed, but it really is going to have a significant impact on development and mobility in the city. I mean, it's really pretty big.
Yeah.
It has a lot of promise and it has a lot of potential peril. One of the things that is promising to me is I think the current system bites, to be honest. My impression is, we approve stuff, we put in mitigation stuff, but then we don't really have a good idea of whether or not those things actually work. I think sometimes we measure, did they put them in, but whether or not it achieved the objective that it was supposed to, I don't think that's ever something that we really do. No. So how, and this will be equally worthless unless we have a way of measuring the effectiveness. How do we intend on doing that?
There's a couple ways. I'm going to tee up these guys first, and then I've got some other answers. But
Well, I'll answer with regard to the tool. One of the challenges right now is that it's difficult to go back and look at even the last 10 projects in your district and say, how did we treat them? What did they agree to? What did they say they were going to do? And did they actually do it? So there's an administrative benefit of having a standard approach where you can say, this was submitted with your development, and you committed to do the following things that are in our menu and others that maybe aren't. And then we can go and say, our tool estimated this many trips. We can count those trips. Our tool estimated these outcomes. We can go check on those outcomes. So there's an administrative benefit of having a sort of a similar treatment for every project that comes in the door, that you will have that available to you. And then on a regular basis, as you see fit, you can go and monitor and evaluate and compare that to what was expected at the beginning. And as David mentioned, over time, if you find that you're perennially not getting what was expected, then things can be updated.
And who actually is going to be doing that? Is that planning? Is that DOT? And that's going to cost money, right?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that we want to try to exploit efficiencies where they're available. So the fact that we would be requiring a lot more monitoring, part of it the onus would fall on the property manager themselves to be able to submit support reports or even help us gain access to the site, potentially maybe from a third party consultant. But I think this also sets up a pretty good platform for a transportation management organization to be able to take care of a lot of that work. We don't really have TMOs covered throughout the city, but it could provide an incentive for some to be established since we're setting up this responsibility. So I mean, I think that there's multiple ways that we can address this, but I think that there would be some onus of the applicant.
we, as kind of a companion to this effort, we've been working, again, with our two departments together on developing an update to our current transportation demand management ordinance. And we hope to be able to come back to you in the next couple of months with some more details about that, because as you can see, a lot of these mitigations, you're only having to do them if you're having to get below a certain threshold. But many of these mitigations we think could be very beneficial to a lot of projects, even just by right projects. And so we'll come back to you and be able to kind of describe that program in more detail. And that also will be a program where hopefully people will have to be doing reporting as part of that. So it'll be another way of us gathering information in terms of the actual reporting on the effectiveness of these issues.
Mr. Chair, I have a few questions too.
Yeah, I think Ms. Reynolds wanted to elaborate.
Oh.
Right.
Or did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say, I think it is us.
Yeah.
Either DOT or DCP, and I think we get clear input from the committee that we want the city to have that role. I also think there are a lot of people who currently review traffic impact analyses that won't be doing that anymore, because this is a much simpler way of, and so a lot of people who sit and do one job now will be doing a mitigation monitoring job after these are adopted.
Excellent. Ms. Martinez.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, so how do you see this metric changing the way we analyze projects such as the Metro East Valley Transit Corridor in my district, or other future projects throughout our different districts?
So how does it?
How does the metric? How is it going to change the way we analyze these projects?
So we would be looking at the projects more from a land use efficiency basis. So the outcome would measure.
How would the new numbers or this new metrics that you're looking at, how would it change the project that's coming down? What would the applicant have to do? How would this apply to the Metro East Valley Transit Corridor that's being proposed to run through Van Nuys Boulevard?
Right.
Oh, so a transportation project. So actually, the guidelines at OPR, they
or light rail, whatever you want.
Right. So one could argue that really a transportation project is not going to generate any vehicle miles traveled because it's actually going to take vehicles off the road. So I think the way we're looking at it right now is those kind of projects would be exempt from looking from this actual analytical category because they aren't generating. They're a very beneficial project from the perception of this new guideline.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the project has included addressing both VMT analysis for transportation projects and VMT analysis for land use projects. What we've presented today is really the development review process around a traditional land use project and how that would change a transportation impact study. In the Office of Planning and Research guidance, there are a number of categories for transportation improvements that are categorically excluded from an environmental analysis requirement. There are others that may have the potential to improve or worsen VMT outcomes. And so we didn't talk a lot about the updates to the city's travel demand forecasting model, but the efforts that were undertaken to make it more sensitive to transit expansion projects, in particular things like bus rapid transit or light rail expansion in the context of a vehicular lane conversion. The city's analysis tools are much more robust now and able to answer those questions from a VMT outcome perspective than they were in the past. So for transportation projects that may need VMT analysis under a CEQA process, the city has got a much more sensitive set of tools. And for projects that are expected to not have negative VMT outcomes because they're a transportation project that's supporting active transportation or transit, there are more categorical exclusions available now than there were before.
And how do you capture passenger information from people who live on one part of the city and then need to travel, for example, into downtown? How do you capture that passenger information? How do you do that now?
Right now, that's measured through, in the existing condition, the demographic characteristics of those locations and their estimated travel patterns. And in the future, as land use forecasts change, especially in the context of long-range transportation changes, the model estimates the land use changes and allocates them to the available transportation systems that are part of the project or not part of the project at that time for analysis. So the way we typically do that is with a travel demand forecasting model and changes to the socioeconomic data inputs, the housing, the employment in those locations, and where they're expected to grow, where they're expected to remain similar. So that's how we capture, maybe I'm not answering your direct question, but that's how the process works now.
What I want to get to is the data that you showed. And so I'm curious, what parts of the city was that trip data collected from? And the reason this is important to me is I just want to make sure as a consultant that you have a good sample in terms of the different types of communities that exist in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So you have the dense neighborhoods like Koreatown and MacArthur Park, but you also have these sprawling San Fernando Valley that, especially communities, for example, in my district, Panorama City, which is very dense, is very different than the community of Arleta in my district.
Right.
So I just want to make sure that there is a good sample when you're collecting data like this. This is why I was, so my question is,
it's a very good question.
Go about collecting this data.
I think that gets fed into this analysis in multiple ways. So, one, when I talked about, we looked at sites that are in Los Angeles, we made sure we sampled from all different geographies in the city. We kind of put them in buckets of areas that generally kind of like have the similar sort of like for like land use characteristics, but we knew that we had to, because Los Angeles, we understand Los Angeles being extremely diverse in terms of just its land use characteristics, and so we wanted to make sure that we were accurately reflecting that when we're collecting the trip data. But what we're getting,
what parts of the city did you collect data from?
we for our housing sites, we actually relied on our affordable housing inventory data that we got from HCID, and it included West LA Valley and downtown. Central area south.
So there were two pieces of it. One was sort of the affordable housing locations that we actually physically went and counted how much traffic was being generated, and there are more than 40 locations like that all across the city that we looked at. Some were near transit, some were not near transit. We tried to make sure we had more suburban, more very urban, and a wide variety of locations on that side. But then we also, in the travel demand model process, in addition to sort of looking at the socioeconomic data characteristics throughout the city, we purchased cell phone travel data for every one of the community planning area zones, so 35 of them all over the city. And we compared that cell phone travel-based data to what the model was telling us about. Of the people who start in this community plan area, how many of them end their trip also in that area? How many of them go nearby? How many of them go all the way over the hill down into UCLA, whatever? And that was part of our modeling calibration process to make sure that this picture of travel, especially as we look forward into the future and we think about projects like 405 Sepulveda or major changes in the transit accessibility, would reflect where those people are wanting to go today, not just in a academic travel model, but also if we look at the data that's coming from your cell phone and where it sleeps at night and where it's going during the day. And that was very consistent, and we calibrated the model to reflect those things too. So there were a number of different ways we tried to get at that. Is because LA is so big and diverse, that's why we broke it up into different standards for different locations and why we looked carefully at a variety of travel patterns across the city.
The other thing is, so in the report, it states that the demand for parking at these sites is lower than the city's standard parking requirements. And so I was curious, how can that even be accurate, for example, in the Valley, where we don't have the same access to public transit as other dense communities throughout the city?
Right, now it's specific to the affordable housing sites. So the affordable housing sites, they did show that the parking utilization was lower, and again, we did sample from Valley sites as in addition to
I just
other
want
sites.
to make sure we're going to compare apples to apples, that it's done correctly.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, that was it.
Okay, Mr. Koretz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have to say this is pretty confusing, so I think we'll be able to digest it after a couple of rounds. But just to oversimplify it and get a sense of this, let's say we were permitting the George Lucas Museum. With the old system, I presume we would assess the impacts on some intersections and we'd try to mitigate traffic flows so that wouldn't be harmed as greatly. If you used vehicle miles traveled for it, this is a huge attraction. It's probably going to be pulling people from everywhere from Palmdale to San Bernardino to San Diego. So it would be a disaster in terms of vehicle miles traveled. Does that mean we discourage locations that are a draw and a tourist attraction because it's terrible for our miles traveled? And how do we mitigate it? Do they have to buy half a transit system because they're having such a potentially huge impact from that standard rather than just try to fix a few intersections?
Right, no, that's a great question. So I think that in the past, under a level of service, or actually that's how that project was evaluated because it was done today, and I don't know the details on it, but I imagine that it probably, again, because it's in a very urban area with obviously the transit nearby, but from an LOS perspective, it probably did have a lot of impacts because there's probably a lot of intersections that are being impacted. And so typically in the past, we would have asked then for an extra right-hand turn lane or a left-hand turn pocket and things that might have, again, exacerbated the physical environment and made it harder and less comfortable and less safe for people who perhaps even walking from the train, to get to the station or get to the museum. Under a vehicle miles traveled perspective, the project is able to really take advantage of the fact that it is located near transit, and so it's going to make assumptions about a percentage of the visitors to the museum that are going to come on transit. Obviously, it's also going to assume that a lot of them are going to be coming, from the car, because you mentioned it is a regional draw. But in order to be able to, let's just say that they have a VMT that is still higher than the APC area that is located in. Again, they would then look to the different TDM options and see if there's ways that they could further mitigate down. If they weren't able to, they would then do a full model. But again, the kinds of things that they're going to be asked to do would be things more that, again, would facilitate somebody taking more transit. So they might be encouraged to do a pedestrian crossing, other things that are going to make it more comfortable for a greater number of people to arrive by transit. Or maybe it's providing shuttles for the more regional visitors. But again, a larger project, you're going to have the opportunity to, work with that applicant directly. It probably be through our major projects team, and they'd be able to have a broader conversation, because a museum is a little bit atypical. This model has been specifically kind of calibrated for your more office, your commercial, your retail, your residential. So contemplating these larger projects are going to really offer an opportunity for some unique conversations about the variety of ways that you might be able to help them mitigate or reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled.
But clearly the idea would be, rather than fixing up the 5 or 6 closest congested intersections, you might take a couple mile offshoot from a transit system to the museum, and you'd be talking about doing something like that, or a shuttle system to the closest transit, so that you'd encourage more transit use, but not help cars flow better to the location.
Exactly.
That's precisely the solutions we'd look at. Yeah.
I think maybe just one other point to mention is that while we are going to be moving away from looking at level of service from a CEQA perspective, it is still a tool that the city, especially DOT, will have as part of its arsenal. It might still look at level of service when looking at perhaps where the driveway is best located especially for a large project. So I just want people to be aware that it's still a tool. We just won't be able to use it from a CEQA perspective.
We think this will be easier and more accurate than doing things like traffic counts, where cars physically pass over a structure and you have a pretty accurate count. Just trying to use data, we think, will be equally as accurate.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is a different data management exercise, but for like the small kind of potato kind of projects, it could be definitely a lot easier just accessing like the project evaluation model. It's much more simpler, less like man-hour intensive. But it does come with, on our end, kind of a maintenancing aspect of it, that we just want to make sure the data continues to be fresh, and we just have this huge opportunity to even provide us a venue of new data sources just through our kind of implementation process, to be able to make that tool even better over time. So there is a maintenancing component to it, but it's not necessarily this sort of like heavy intensive labor-intensive approach that like a traffic study may take in terms of like collecting data at like 20 intersections, on a project.
Right. I would say one of the biggest changes too, I think we're going to see with this, is that the LOS tool today disadvantages projects in the very places you want to be putting them. So for example, a 100-unit apartment building going into downtown, because it's an area that already is heavily congested, is actually going to be hit with a lot of mitigations. And that's why, again, you might be asked to do a lot of widenings, where a project in the valley, in an area where perhaps don't have as much congestion, you don't have as much tools to be able to require them to do mitigations, because the streets are more free-flowing, where in this case, the project being located in downtown is going to, from a vehicle miles perspective, is going to show that you're not going to generate as many vehicle miles, because again, it has the transit proximity and access, where in the Valley B doesn't have as much. So again, you're going to have more tools to be able to require projects to do the right thing that again are more contextually based for the setting that project is located in.
You have questions? Yeah. Go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Councilmember Colquitt says, this is really a lot to absorb. Going back to your evidence of affordable housing low VMT slide, can you go back, that one? So can you explain that? What is that?
Yeah, this is data that was collected through the California Household Travel Survey, and that these were people that were filling out travel diaries, and it's categorizing those people based on their income categories. So they're broken out into the income categories, I think, that we generally assign when we're looking at.
So basically, it's showing that lower income individuals have lower vehicle mile trips.
That's exactly it.
It's not comparing to actual traffic counts.
It's not driven by traffic counts. It's driven by, so people are completing travel diaries and talking about, they're explaining what their regular travel patterns are.
So the next slide I just want to make sure I understand this. Next slide shows that the IT handbook often projects.
That's right.
So when you guys did actual trip counts actually should be lower.
These are the trip, yeah, so these were taken through pneumatic tubes at the driveway locations, just seeing cars coming in and out of specific development projects, and that's exactly what it's showing.
Right. And then the next. Can you go next one? So this one, this one, yeah. What is this VMT impact criteria? What does this mean?
So this would be really the kind of the measuring stick, the impact criteria that we would be comparing project level impacts to. So, for example, if there was a housing project that was in downtown LA and in the project evaluation model showed that VMT per capita was, say, 9.0, it would have to mitigate to below 6.2 would be this central city, that's like the Central Area Planning Commission average.
So VMT per person versus VMT per employee?
Yeah, so that's right. So we're assigning different different impact criteria to households or housing residential versus employer sites because they do have different travel characteristics that we want to take into account in our evaluation process.
And that's consistent with the statewide
Right, so-
guidance. Yeah.
So traffic counts are easy to do. I mean, you put a strip down and you see how many cars pass by. So it's a question that one of the other council members asked. So how do you measure this VMT?
So VMT, you need both. You need to know not only how many vehicles are leaving and coming to and from a site, but you also need some sense about how far they're going. To the point about, is this a regional museum or is this a local neighborhood, shop that most of the people are coming and going nearby? Mm-hmm. Today, we don't know that very well at all from our traditional traffic study methods. You and I may have the exact same project, but your draw is going to require double the travel on the system. Mine requires half, but we get treated the same. So the best ways that we have to do that are to combine household travel surveys where people are actually asked, when did you leave, where did you go, how far did you go, and those are geographically available throughout.
How do you compare it to someone who's coming from clear across town? How big is a survey size?
Yeah. So the way we do that in practice is we combine that travel diary survey information with travel demand forecasting models and actual counts of travel on the system. So if we're off on any one or more of those, then there's probably going to be a disconnect between the forecast and what the model is estimating should be happening on a given street and what we can actually go and count. So that's the comparison that's done and the tools that are used. Anticipating where you might be going next, right now, if we have a monitoring program and we say in our project evaluation model, your project was expected to generate 2,000 trips, we can count those periodically and say, are you generating 1,900 or are you generating 2,700? And then we can behave differently.
So
and that's, if it's less than we estimated, it's going to be less VMT, all things being equal, if we were right about those distances. But at a minimum, we need to know how many trips are coming.
So going back to Councilwoman Nuri Martinez's question, so based on like a development that's going in, if the developer meets all these targets and has a reduction of 15%, what's their incentive? Is there incentive? What's their incentives that they get?
So they in order to meet that target, if they have to mitigate, they have to incorporate those TDM measures into their conditions of approval and actually, do those things that they're signing up for. And then if they're below level of significance, I guess then they would be able to proceed with their environmental review process.
So I'm just going to wrap this up here, but do we have any choice in this? Since this is a state law, I mean, is this a must? We have to do this, or?
Well, I think as David was explaining earlier, that if we don't do this, 2 years after the state adopts this new program, and we don't have something in place, we wouldn't have any tools to be able to evaluate projects. So this is the direction the state is going.
Because in page 2 of the report, it says, regionally, a collection of cities and agencies are urging the Office of Planning and Research to maintain level of service as a transportation metric in suburban areas versus vehicle miles traveled. So
Yeah.
are other cities not are they going to stick to LOS?
Well, so this is this is coming from other jurisdictions in the SCAG region that feel that they're going to be particularly disadvantaged from a VMT standpoint, largely because their VMT is very high, and so development projects would continue to post impacts, and they don't want to feel burdened to expand or to develop housing and economic development and such. So they are pressuring SCAG to then, in turn, try to still maintain the two systems. It just doesn't seem likely that Office of Planning Research is going to go that approach just because VMT is satisfying a whole host of outcomes.
Yeah.
Mr. Bertoni, did you want to ask?
Because my memory of the situation is that the state passed the law, they handed it off, so the legislature passed the law, and the governor signed it, but it moved over to the governor's office for rulemaking, right? So what we know is the fact that the state's requiring a move from LOS to VMT. What that actually looks like, we don't yet know. Rulemaking is not finished yet. It looks like how it is written is that we have to move. It's not quite clear. It could be that we're required to move completely from LOS to VMT, or there may be a different combination of that at the state. So some cities, and it looks like where the governor's office is heading is everyone moves from LOS to VMT. Some cities have been advocating that suburban areas don't move from LOS to VMT. So that's what the discussion is, because the governor's office said the rulemaking is not complete. Some cities have gotten ahead of it because they believe that they can see the writing on the wall that their cities will most likely have to do it. And we're in that scenario where they will most likely have to go from LOS to VMT. Pasadena, Santa Monica, and San Francisco have moved off of LOS to VMT. Pasadena's about when I was there. And we actually were ahead of the state because it was less of a matter of state requirement as much as that's where the city was heading anyway. So that's why it's kind of a little confusing in the report, because I believe the SCAD advocacy was more about the state rulemaking.
Well, obviously, I'm sure we'll get more briefings on this. And Mr. Chair, I mean, I have a mixed feeling about it too, just like yourself. I mean, I honestly think this is the future. I mean, this is what every city is going to have to do. But I also have a lot of concerns because I think this might have a lot of unintended consequences. Like, I think in downtown LA, it makes perfect sense for this to happen. But for certain transit-oriented development, I mean, you stated that it's supposed to technically not generate traffic, and especially if it's affordable housing, I fully agree. This is why I fully support affordable housing, especially on TOD areas. But in my district, I have developers building on a transit-oriented development on a metro station, and they're building luxury condos or luxury apartments, which they are not they're not going downstairs and taking the subway or the metro. So, and they're creating vehicle traffic. I mean, traffic counts. So I look forward to see how this is going to happen, but it's I just want to make sure that both systems are somehow incorporated, because in certain areas I don't want it to mask what's really happening.
No, I think you're really bringing up a good point. And just to clarify, I think when we're talking about projects that would be exempted, those are actually the transit projects themselves. But for an example, in your area, that the first thing the project would do is that it would put itself into the tool. The tool has been calibrated, again, using the traffic demand forecasting model that the city gets from SCAG. And the SCAG actually takes the time to look down at what they call these TAZs, the Transportation Analyst Zones. Each TAZ is identified with a specific VMT, and Jeremy, you'll jump in to correct me on any of this. So basically, based on that project's specific location, there's a TAZ or a VMT attached to that. So that VMT, as Jeremy was describing, uses a lot of information that SCAG collects over time to really kind of replicate what the average VMT is for that area. So an area that that has a lot of higher incomes, isn't as close to transit, is going to have a higher TAZ than in other areas. And so you take that TAZ then plus then the actual number of trips that that specific project is going to generate, and that's going to then, in the model, put out a number. Based on where that project is located, then, it has to then get the 15% below than the VMT for the APC that it's located in. So hopefully, again, this has been calibrated in such a way that we are going to require projects that have more impacts than to have to do more things. And so an area that today, though, has higher VMT because of some of the characteristics you described, but hopefully over time, because maybe that project then, because it would have mitigations, it would have to maybe require transit passes, things to get those more market rate-based residents to take transit more often. So hopefully over time, we'll be able to measure that and then again recalibrate the model.
If I could also...
I just wanted to put a fine point sort of on what everybody has said is this is not, we don't have a choice whether to do this. We have a choice on how to do this, and that's what this is about. But we do not have a choice on whether to do it. It's a state law, and the state has dictated that. And it was, frankly, it was one of the bigger environmental bills that has been passed in Sacramento in recent years. And it's, you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that San Francisco, Santa Monica, Pasadena, 3 cities that are generally considered to be environmental leaders have been the ones that have gotten up front and figuring out how. Right. So there's things we can look at from them. Ours may be different, but we have to figure out the how, knowing that it's coming.
Right, which is why I think we spent as much time as we did, you know, in bringing on fair and peers to really make sure that we had the analytical rigor behind this tool, and that's why we're also excited to put it out kind of for evaluation this summer. So before it goes into effect, we're going to have time to really, you know, test it. Is it as simple to understand? Is it giving us the results that we think make sense from a...
Well, actually, Ken Bernstein, Department of City Planning. I was actually jumping up to make a similar point and to respond to Councilmember Rue's comment and Councilmember Martinez's concerns earlier. You know, I think as you said, Councilmember Bonin, we don't have a choice of whether to do this. We do have a choice of how to do it. We wanted to get out ahead of where the state was. There's been quite a bit of back and forth and uncertainty, and I think the passage Councilmember Rue was referring to was that there has been various points of view expressed by other jurisdictions around the state. We wanted to be leaders in this area and to embrace this new direction of the state, to get out ahead of the final guidelines that are being put forward. But by putting this out for review, this is something that will be a new tool, a new model that will be used by the development community, by consultants who recognize that we are shifting away from level of service to this new methodology. There's an opportunity, I think, to start using it, looking at different parts of the city, testing projects in the North Valley, on the west side, in the central city area, and have the profession, the professional consultants and the development community begin to give us feedback on this before it is set in stone and before the state also finalizes its approach. So we look forward to working with all of you in testing this in the coming months.
And there's a reason I've asked for updates in this committee. I mean, I assume Mr. Weezar will ask for reports in Plum as well. It is a big thing. It is a really big thing, and it easily could be the kind of thing that is a big thing that the council really doesn't know about until the last minute. And between this committee and Plum, that means at least 2/3 of the council will be repeatedly briefed on it. Mm-hmm. And so I appreciate the work everybody's done. I've got some concerns still about the how, but there's time to feed in on that. Personally, I think the APC areas may be too big and not reflective enough of sort of the microclimates. I mean, Ms. Martinez talked just about the difference between 2 communities in her district. The East Valley, the West Valley, very different. Just parts of my district internally are different. So, but there's certainly more time other than today to get into that. And we're only seeing sort of a small snapshot today of sort of the full breadth of mitigations that will be required. So I'd like to ask you guys to come back in 90 days with an update, more detail, an overview of the full suite of applicable transportation mitigation programs, and maybe an update on the evaluation tool, where things are with the TDM ordinance and CEQA threshold updates.
Great, thank you.
Okay, all right. And even though it was dense, I think we succeeded in making it not entirely wonky.
Great.
Really?
It's a little one.
Almost. We skated right above. All right. Thank you. Okay, so that concludes the regular meeting. We will adjourn the regular meeting. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Mr. Williams, you had a public comment on this? See, I didn't want to miss you. That's why I asked you to go first, but... So we haven't adjourned yet. We're going to do Mr. Williams' comment first.
Okay. Dr. Tom Williams, Sierra Club Transportation Committee, and I came specifically for the presentation and regarding the PMT versus VMT. You ever heard of PMT? Passenger mile traveled. In LA 32 Neighborhood Council, we had a problem with the 710 freeway. Oh, well, there were only 180,000 vehicles per day. 40,000 of those were actually trucks. In the presentation title page, it showed buses and one truck and cars. What's the big difference between VMT and PMT? Passenger miles traveled. That is, why don't we get on bus? You mentioned TDM, demand management. The primary demand management measure is transit. So PMT should be used, not VMT. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so that concludes the regular meeting. We will adjourn, and we will open the special meeting with the same composition of the committee. Item number 22.
Item number 22 is the City Attorney Report and Ordinance relative to amending the Municipal Code Sections 80.00 and 87.53 to amend the definition of parkway and prohibit the stopping, standing, or parking of a vehicle in the parkway.
Great. We just had this item in committee just a couple weeks ago, asking the city attorney to draft the ordinance, which they've done. I have one public comment card, Mr. Barry Johnson.
Hello, Barry Johnson, Studio City Neighborhood Council Transportation Committee Chair. We support this. We did not get our CIS in time, but we do have a question, and that is, are driveway aprons also included within the parkway since they cross and are on the parkway? Because cars are parked on these driveway aprons within parkways, and they stick both out into the street and over the sidewalk. And we have a city that's asking us to walk, but so many times on sidewalks, there's cars sticking over the sidewalk on these parkway aprons. And the one other thing I wish our city would do, and I think we could free up so many parking spaces, we'd never have to park on a parkway, and that is if people would clean out their garages and park in them.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Let's just ask city attorney to give a report. My understanding is in response to the apron question is the CDC doesn't prohibit apron parking, but does prohibit encroaching into the sidewalk. So the O'Farrell motion, which this implements, didn't ask for the apron prohibition, just the encroachment prohibition and everything else.
Right. The city has police powers to regulate a parkway and the public right-of-way to the extent that we're not preempted under state law. In terms of the question that was asked by the gentleman, the state law does regulate how you can park if it encroaches a sidewalk, as mentioned by the council member, or if the vehicle projects into the street. This law does not include the driveway apron is excluded. It's intended for vehicle use, so ingress, egress in and out of your property. However, the city is still bound by state law, and we will continue to enforce under state law. It just won't be locally. It'll be through the California Vehicle Code section starting at 22500, which prohibits a vehicle from parking on any portion of a sidewalk, as I said, projecting into the street, parking next to a fire hydrant, fire station, bus stop. There are distance requirements, a red curb or curb cuts for the disabled. So all of those people need to be aware of that just because you may be able to park in your apron under our local ordinance, it doesn't mean under state law that you can do so, and the city will enforce under state law.
So the ordinance is drafted, as I understand it, add some clarity to existing ordinance, defines a parkway as the area of the public right-of-way not intended for vehicular use between the sidewalk and the curb, or where no curb exists between the sidewalk and the public street, which the city has reserved for landscaping and utilities, and clarifies another vague section of the current code by adding in an explanation of parkway and prohibiting stopping, standing, or parking a vehicle within the area of the parkway as defined in 80.00H of this code.
That's correct. And to be clear, people need to understand that all of the laws under the Los Angeles Municipal Code will be back into effect, meaning you cannot drive onto a parkway as defined in this section. If it's not intended, if it's not your driveway apron, you're going to be cited for that. You know, there were a number of sections that weren't being enforced for some reason that could have been enforced. For instance, you can't build anything, you can't pave without a city permit on a parkway, and that is going to be in full force and effect now. So people need to be aware that they're going to have to move off the parkway portion that was intended for landscaping, city utilities, parking meters, and everything else that the city has control over.
Mr. Kretz?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Non-transportation related question with the parkways. I know we've had some questions about planting drought-tolerant landscaping and the desirability of that, and yet there's some people that have been cited for doing it. Did we ever clarify anything relating to that as part of this process?
This was just directly related to vehicle use. That would be through the street services and public works. That would be their area of jurisdiction, and this wasn't a part of this particular.
Do we have any idea where that particular issue stands? Are we still citing people for doing what essentially we want them to do?
Councilman, I believe that the Street Services has it on their website, what you're allowed to park and, or what you're allowed to plant and whatnot, but I'll try to find that for your staff.
It wasn't part of what I was.
So we didn't take a look at that as while we were at this process?
They may have, but it just wasn't through this committee.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, seeing no further questions, unless there's an objection, this item will be recommended for full council approval. Do we have a date for council yet?
No.
Before
Soon as
recess?
it goes next Wednesday.
Okay, great. We should get this done before recess for sure. Okay, thank you very much. We are now adjourned.